We've had plenty of previous storms that we described as wake-up calls. These wake-up calls that would prompt new behaviors, new flows of money to help those affected by the storms, and new actions, new measures to protect the storm's communities, environment, businesses from future flooding. But like the tired person that repeatedly hits the snooze button on the alarm clock, New Jersey has failed to heed these warnings from these deadly storms. Now, Governor Murphy pledged to be bolder and to respond to the wake-up calls that his predecessors slept through. In January of 2020, 20 months before Ida, Governor Murphy took an important action to address the ever-present threat of flooding in the state when he issued Executive Order 100 to protect the state from climate change-induced flooding, creating an initiative called New Jersey Protecting Against Climate Threats, or NJPACT. That initiative directed DEP to incorporate climate change considerations into its regulatory, permitting, and land use programs, including stormwater and water supply. He promised new regulations would be adopted by January 2022. Obviously, that deadline has been missed. After countless stakeholder meetings with environmentalists and representatives from the business and the building community in the state, NJDEP announced in May some very bold measures that were, frankly to us, although bold, basic common sense, and the result of an extraordinary amount of scientific assessment of weather patterns and climate in the state of New Jersey. Turns out the data we've been using to set flood zones, to require stormwater mitigation, is decades out of date. In fact, we're using a number of years to determine a typical storm, the last of which was 1999. DEP has recognized this. The governor's recognized this. Now, what does that mean? The problem with this means we're allowing new developments in flood zones, which puts lives at risk, and we're not requiring adequate stormwater measures to mitigate the stormwater that pours off these new developments. And that really impacts towns like Manville that are located downstream at the bottom of our watersheds, if you will. Now, DEP proposed to do something about it by updating the data and, in fact, leaning in and forecasting the size of storms into the future that would result from climate change. But when the builders squawked and wrote a letter to the governor and weighed in, suddenly this proposal that DEP had told everybody in May was about to come forward as an emergency rule disappeared. And when asked about the delays at a press conference just last week, Governor Murphy responded that it's complicated. It's not complicated, Governor. Heed the science, support the work of your administration scientists, and approve this critical emergency rule. It's time to heed Ida's warning. It's time to stop hitting the snooze button. It's time to take action. It's time to wake up. Now, I'm very pleased to be accompanied by some terrific leaders and critical players in these issues of flooding and stormwater. We have several elected members of Congress who have really been on the forefront of this issue, and several of my colleagues in the environmental community. We're going to start with our true host, the mayor of Manville, a great leader, Mr. Richard Onderko.
Thank you, Jim. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to one of the most patriotic and resilient towns in Somerset County. I'm very proud to say I'm from Manville. This is my childhood street I grew up on, and I was taken out of my childhood home in a boat in 1971. So this problem has persisted for over 50 to 60 years in town, and it's time we do something about it. So first, I would like to thank Jim Waltman and the Watershed Institute for bringing attention to the need for stricter stormwater management rules, attention to climate change with more intense storms, and the overdevelopment we see going on all around us today. Apartment buildings and warehouses are taking over our landscapes. My hometown, the borough of Manville, is ground zero to see the adverse effects of poor stormwater regulations over the last several decades as more and more impervious cover is added into our watershed. Some older developments have no stormwater management, and newer developments need to do more in terms of retention. Sadly, stormwater runoff from upstream communities ends up right here in Manville. The proposed new regulations will benefit all those who live here and call New Jersey their home. The flooding problems we encounter are a man-made problem and a serious quality of life issue throughout our state. Without improvements to stormwater regulations, the flooding problems will only become much worse. The new rules in the executive order are part of a man-made solution to help mitigate the flooding problems my town faces. I urge Governor Murphy to sign the executive order today. Please help Manville. 1 year ago, the remnants of Hurricane Ida devastated sections of Manville. The disaster recovery process has been slow. We need a sense of urgency to help my residents get out of harm's way. Again, Governor Murphy, please help Manville recover faster. My residents deserve better from FEMA. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. Now, the mayor from the other end of the Millstone watershed, Mayor Barbara Rogers from Cranberry Township.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Dr. Barbara Rogers, and I'm from Cranberry, and I am upstream from Manville. So thank you for inviting me and allowing me to share the Township of Cranberry's experience. I'm going to talk a little bit more about Tropical Storm Henri and a little bit about Ida and a few steps we have taken to address riverine flooding and why we need the New Jersey DEP emergency rules to protect New Jersey from storms and flooding from climate change. Water rescues from submerged cars, local road closures, traffic signal and power outages, homes and businesses' basements and first floor inundated with over 4 feet of water. The main road through our historic village that we worked so hard to preserve was filled with water, and the nearby lake, Brainerd Lake, was breached and upstream water spilled over into the road, eventually finding its way back to the river where it traveled downstream to the next town. On August 22nd, 2021, Cranberry was drenched with nearly 9 inches of rain in 2 hours and received an historic amount of rainfall as Tropical Storm Henri sat over the township. The storm system drenched Main Street, and nearby Brainerd Lake couldn't handle it and spilled over. Days later, of course, local roads were still closed or blocked due to flooding. Residents and businesses were filling dumpsters with damaged goods, and police continued to warn people not to cross barriers and defy detours. We are thankful for our fire department, who used rafts to rescue stranded pedestrians and motorists in submerged cars. Our police, who managed road closures and sheltered stranded motorists at the station. Our DPW, who cleaned up and helped with stormwater management. And residents, who offered sump pumps, hoses, and other tools to their neighbors. Just 10 days later, on September 1st, Ida struck New Jersey. Ida caused flash flooding all through Middlesex County, including in Cranberry Township, closing several roadways in flood-prone areas. We were spared the worst of the storm. The Cranberry Police Department and emergency service personnel did not have any water rescues in Cranberry, and Brainerd Lake Bridge did not overspill this time. We did have power outages, and our officers worked throughout the night guiding motorists to avoid roadways. After these two events, the township formed a small local resiliency subcommittee made of volunteers. We worked with the police and DPW to identify our flood-prone areas, provided them to FEMA at a FEMA Discovery virtual meeting with other local officials to help them update their outdated 1999 federal flood maps and prioritize streams in our local watershed for future studies, and we plan to have our stormwater infrastructure mapped in the future. Waterways do not stop at Cranberry's boundary. Our township has 3 major rivers and brooks that flow from west to east: the Millstone River, Cedar Brook, and Cranberry Brook. Each of these run the length of the township and flows through our townships nearby. Input is required from surrounding municipalities and require analysis and solutions both up and downstream and across boundary lines. Middlesex County recognizes the tremendous impact this flood has had on the southern portion of the county and is working to address the impact of climate change on local riverine flooding. A newly formed Southern Middlesex Flood Mitigation and Resiliency Working Group is looking at flooding in our area with regional watershed approach across town boundaries to mitigate flood risk and increase resiliency to extreme weather. This is an opportunity to engage with 10 other towns to identify engineering, nature-based, and policy solutions to local flooding. These are not issues that the municipality or the county can solve alone, but that it will take resources from all levels of government to identify measures to increase resiliency to extreme weather. This flooding cannot be attributed to any one cause, but rather a myriad of causes on a local, regional, and global scale. The recent State of the Climate report in 2021 projects more precipitation and more severe storms. More rain equals more stormwater runoff. More runoff equals increased riverine flow. More flow equals higher flood elevation. We need additional tools now to protect our residents, municipalities, businesses, and the environment from the impact of climate change. The New Jersey DEP has prepared emergency rules to prevent new development in flood-prone areas and make our state's stormwater mitigation rules more effective. New Jersey current land use regulations rely on outdated data from 1999. Current stormwater management systems cannot treat the storms our state is experiencing. We are one of the communities in New Jersey that endured devastating floods and historic levels of rainfall. A common sense approach has been proposed by the New Jersey DEP using updated rainfall data for flood hazard regulations. We must protect lives, health, and property and advance strong new rules to protect New Jersey from climate change, to protect communities from storms and flooding. The township of Cranberry and surrounding communities suffered significant damage due to Tropical Storm Henri and Ida. Flooding damage during Henri displaced homeowners and impacted business with 4 to 6 feet of water. Tropical Storm Ida struck New Jersey within only 10 days of Henri, and FEMA issued a disaster declaration as a result of Ida. Water does not know town, county, or state boundaries. The New Jersey DEP emergency rules allows for unified action across the state to protect people and property. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. Next up, David Cohen. He's a councilman from the town of Princeton. David's been a real leader in that town's efforts to combat stormwater and flooding as well. David, thank you.
Thanks, Jim. So, what is a Princeton councilman doing hogging the microphone at a press conference in Manville? Aside from the fact that I was invited, and a good politician never passes up an opportunity to make a speech, there really is a connection between Princeton's stormwater management and Manville's stormwater woes. Much of Princeton's runoff makes its way to Lake Carnegie, which discharges to the Millstone River, a tributary of the Raritan River. While the outflow from the lake is usually controlled, in a major storm event, the outlet structures, and indeed the entirety of Route 27, under which they flow, are completely inundated, and water flows unimpeded out of the lake. The Millstone and Raritan actually converge in Manville, so in the event of major storms, which are occurring more and more frequently in recent years, our runoff ends up in your basements and even first floors. The way we handle stormwater as a society is at its root a classic example of the tragedy of the commons. When everybody uses our natural resources, in this case our waterways, in an unconstrained manner, everyone suffers. No one individual has an incentive to curtail their own use of the resource, because they will still suffer if everyone else continues to abuse the resource. That's why we need rules to govern how all members of society can use the commons. Over the last half century, we have gradually put in place rules to restrict stormwater discharge to our waterways and regulating the quality of the water discharged. But those rules are only as good as the data underlying them. With climate change, our rules are woefully out of date, requiring developers to design only for yesteryear's storms, when we know that even designing for today's storms is not enough to protect us in the future. And the great irony is that our rules are designed only to handle the more frequent storms. They are designed to fail when there is a big storm, exactly those storms which do the most damage and which are becoming more and more frequent. The emergency rules under New NJ Pact, which we are here today to support, will not solve the problem all by themselves, but they will at least require us to be honest with ourselves about the scale of the problem. In the Northeast, stormwater is the great challenge we face from climate change. Other parts of the country and the world face different challenges: drought, unlivable heat, crop failure, and more. When I talk about this with constituents, I actually emphasize how lucky we are. Compared to some other regions, our problems are manageable. It reminds me of the old joke about the definition of successful parenting. Tell me if you've heard this. When your children's neuroses are treatable. Our climate change problems are treatable, but we must engage with them heads on, and we need help from the state to avert the current tragedy of the commons. New Jersey must issue the emergency rules, which will allow communities throughout the state to realistically plan for the threat we all know is coming, and which for communities like Manville is already here.
David, thank you. Wonderful. I'm going to now have David Pringle, as campaign director at Clean Water Action. He's going to read a statement from the mayor of Cranford.
Thanks, Jim. I'm a lifelong resident like the mayor, and my house I was evacuated in 1971 when I was 5 as well. I live on the river now. I purposely picked the house because it's on the river, a little higher ground, but we still got water in the basement from Ida and Irene. The Cranford Mayor, Kathleen Miller-Prunty, asked me to read this statement, so let me go on. Like so many communities, Cranford was devastated by Ida on September 1st, 2021. One of the hardest impacted, with more than 9 inches of rain falling 2 to 3 inches an hour, according to the National Weather Service. While we had no loss of life, 200 people had to be rescued. 665 homes were damaged, and municipal buildings, countless businesses, and cars were severely affected, upending people's lives. Damage in Cranford was $4.4 million. A video of a Cranford Homes Foundation collapsing with the residents in the basement went viral. Thankfully, the owners were rescued. Ida was like no other storm, and due to climate change, more is coming. It's not a matter of if, it's only a matter of when. I appreciate Governor Murphy visiting Cranford last year, a couple days right after the storm, and again recently to announce $1.8 million funding for one of our stormwater projects. The governor stated his agreement that more must be done to address the persistent threat of flooding, that climate change is a new reality that's getting worse and we must adapt. Our flood maps and rainfall data haven't been updated since 1999 and include some data going back to 1899. The governor was right to order DEP to strengthen these rules 2.5 years ago to better keep people and property out of harm's way from the increased rainfall and flooding due to the climate emergency. And DEP was right in May to announce these long-promised, long-delayed flood hazard and stormwater rules need to go forward. They can't be implemented fast enough before the next IDA. That's the end of Mayor Printy's statement. Now I'm going to put solely my Clean Water Action hat on. I can speak a little more frankly. The governor ordered DEP to fix this situation 2.5 years ago. Soon after that, we got hit by COVID, and that is certainly part of the explanation for a little bit of a delay. But given that the administration, dozens of times since then, has said these rules are 3 months away or 6 months away, so COVID doesn't explain it. There's no chance, period. The DEP commissioner would be fired if DEP made the announcement they did in May without the governor's sign-off. So it is a farce to say it is complicated. It is the only thing that has changed since those DEP meetings in May and the decision in June to delay these rules is politics. It was an emergency in May. It was an emergency 2.5 years ago. It's an emergency now. We have lost the chance to address these problems this hurricane season. It is not too late to address them come next hurricane season. Had the rules been proposed by regular order back in May, we would be most of the way through adopted rules. They still can be expedited whether you do it on an emergency basis or not. The time is now. People's lives are hanging in the balance, and we need the governor to act.
Thanks, Dave. Doug O'Malley, Executive Director of Environment New Jersey.
Thank you, Jim. My name is Doug O'Malley. I serve as the Director for Environment New Jersey, representing 80,000 citizen members and activists across the state. And I wanted to give my thanks to the mayor and all the elected officials, because we're here obviously because 1 year after President Biden visited Manville, Ida is not over. It's not over for this family and this home behind us. It's not over for the many communities that we've heard have been impacted by Ida. And it's certainly not over for the families, the 30 families that lost family members because of Ida's flooding. We've heard from Mayor Rogers that it wasn't just Ida. It was also Tropical Storm Henri. Before Henri, it was Elsa. Before Elsa, it was Sandy. We're a month away from the 10th anniversary of Sandy. Before Sandy, it was Floyd, more than 23 years ago. Times have changed from 1999, and it is clear we need those new rules. And Governor Murphy himself said that a year ago, we need a new playbook to deal with climate change. Well, a year later, the playbook still needs to be updated. And it's time for Governor Murphy to move forward with NJPAC rules. These NJPAC rules are not about regulations. They're about people's lives. They're about protecting our communities, and they're about acknowledging that climate change is not some far-off threat. It is here now. And so listening to the mayor talk about being rescued more than 50 years ago in Manville, those, as the mayor can attest, the flooding has gotten worse, but not just in Manville. In communities that never have seen flooding. What used to be a 500-year flood is now a 100-year flood. What used to be a 1,000-year flood is now a 500-year flood. They are happening all too often. We need to take broader action on climate change, specifically to reduce emissions. This is another area the governor is committed to and not followed through. But we need action right now on making sure that we are protecting our communities, using the best available science from DEP, because the science is there. the science is also right in front of us. And anytime you're trying to protect yourself from a flood, you don't evacuate when the floodwaters are at your doorstep. You plan, you prepare. And that's what we are asking Governor Murphy and his administration to do. DEP has done that work over the last year to accommodate the impacts from Ida in these NJPAC flood rules. It is time to take them off the shelf, put them into place to ensure that we're not putting more people and more communities into harm's way with new development that thinks it's still 1999. It's not 1999 anymore. Climate change is real, it's happening, and these flood rules need to happen now. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. Okay, last speaker is Bill Kibler. He's the policy director at Raritan Headwaters.
Good afternoon. I saw in the news this weekend on the Bloomberg news feed that FEMA has finally publicly acknowledged that their flood maps and their data are woefully out of date and woefully inaccurate, which I'm sure was not news to anyone standing up here. I'm sure it's not news to anyone who lives in a flood-prone area like Manville. And I strongly suspect it wasn't news to FEMA either. What that means is that we have several state agencies and 50 states operating with data and flood maps for the last century. Planning is about looking ahead, and that's what we need to do. That's what the DEP is doing or trying to do with the new regulations, and that's what we need to have happen here in New Jersey. That's not actually what I wanted to talk to you about today. As some of my colleagues up here know, I'm also a volunteer firefighter. I'm the past chief of my fire company. We're the crazy fools that get out of bed at 2 o'clock in the morning, leave our homes, leave our families when our neighbors need us for something like this, whether it's fire or flood. I don't know what you all were doing during Ida, but I have a very vivid memory of what I was doing. I was standing in the south branch of the Raritan River, about hip deep, with a red life jacket on, strapped to a tree behind me. One of my fellow firefighters had tied me to a tree so I wouldn't get swept away. We were there because we had 3 young men, 3 middle school kids, who'd gotten overwhelmed by the waters in the south branch and had to be rescued. I'm very happy to say that because of the efforts of my fellow first responders and the grace of God, they were not among those who were killed during Ida, but they could have been. And there were a lot of other folks like them in similar circumstances. Dave and I were at the press conference last week when Governor Murphy said it's complicated. Governor, it's not complicated. In fact, I would be happy to invite the governor to come with me the next time I have to respond to a flooding call for the next one of these terrible storms and explain to my neighbors, who will be busy having the worst day of their lives because that's when I show up on their front doorstep, how complicated it is. It is not complicated, Governor. The rules are ready. We need them. We've needed them for decades. They're well overdue. We need to get them out. When I'm called to respond to an emergency, I don't get to tell my neighbors it's complicated and show up when I feel like it. It needs to be done, and it needs to be done today. If my fellow first responders, firefighters, EMTs, police, myself, if we can get out of our homes and leave our families behind in the middle of a terrible storm like Ida or Irene or Sandy, when everybody's worried first and foremost about their families, I have to leave my family to take care of my neighbors, and I do it gladly. So do my fellow first responders. But if we can put our lives on the line to help our neighbors when they're in need because of a terrible storm or some other disaster, the least we can do here in New Jersey is try to make sure that we limit the likelihood of that happening again. We have the ability to protect people's lives and to protect their homes and their businesses. So let's get off the dime and get it done today. Thank you.